The federal moratorium on evictions is set to expire on June 30th. That could result in many Americans losing their housing. The Biden administration is planning to provide relief to these renters by, quote, racing to end a bottleneck that has prevented state and local governments from distributing nearly $50 billion in rental assistance that Congress allocated to keep those tenants from going over a financial cliff.
Democratic strategist, owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp, and Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. They join us now to discuss. Rachel, let me start with you. I do think there's been a lot of talk about optimism. I've been talking about it as well, economic outlook, etc. But of course, there has been this rent forbearance and eviction moratorium here on the line for millions of Americans. Is this something that could just change the way that we think about the future? And how politically can it manifest itself as we move forward?
Well, this goes back to, what the government can and should do in a crisis. And I do think that, this has changed a lot of the thinking on the Republican Party, and about how we need to approach that issue going forward. But I also think it speaks to just the dramatic imbalance of infrastructure, across the country. We saw this with unemployment. Right. We as much money as the federal government pumped into unemployment assistance, you couldn't get it out in the states. And this is a very similar issue. Now, you'd think a lot of members would be focused on this issue. But it was interesting. The list of earmarks came out earlier this week, and I went through it and I was looking for people, focused on this issue. And there wasn't. There were a lot of earmarks for equity, not a lot for sort of state run assistance offices, which seem like they really need a lot of help right now.
Yeah. And Jen, that's basically the issue is the money was allocated. It's overwhelmingly been distributed to states and localities, but very little of it has gone out the door in terms of rental assistance. So you're really kind of facing this cliff. Renters who got behind this year are going to be facing a huge bill in order to stay in their homes and in their apartments once this moratorium is lifted. So far, the cash assistance isn't getting out there. And I think it also reflects on the fact that a lot of people did really well during the pandemic, were able to, they spent less money, they saved, they were able to take advantage of government programs. But because we had this K-shaped recovery, you also have a significant number of people who are just completely screwed. Those people are going to be really vulnerable once the moratorium expires.
And we need to look at this from a macro sense, too, because the rental assistance is also by proxy mortgage assistance, because in a lot of situations, it is not some big, barren landlord that we're talking about here. It's, somebody who is running a couple properties and that's their income. So by proxy, we're helping them as well. This is something that is wildly popular. Forget about Democrat, Republican, but just across the board in the country. In terms of making sure that the administration pays attention to. So I actually don't think you're going to see a lot of pushback anywhere because of this. This is happening in red states just as much as it's happening in blue states. And something needs to be done immediately to make sure that we don't actually fall off of this cliff.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm curious from your perspective in terms of politics, because I'm trying to game out, it could be one scenario in which we're living like in the 90s, like stock market boom, middle class and all of that. Yeah, obviously, inequality, wage stagnation actually all began right then with NAFTA in there, but it took like 20 years for it to manifest. The other way is this could be a 2008-2009 situation where despite some government assistance that you're going to see kind of a hollowing out of the middle class and more, which results in the Tea Party wave and Trump and so much more. Which way of those two are you thinking about it? Or is there like a middle third way?
I sadly think it might be the latter. I think this pandemic has really illustrated, again, sort of the massive corporate profits, that didn't suffer. And then I think the lower rung of that is what I call the laptop class, the people that never actually lost their job but stayed at home and were able to work successfully, sort of fueling the profits of Amazon, and everyone else. And then you have the rung below that who, we sort of tried to get assistance to, but there was no real infrastructure to do so. And they're falling behind in a way that I'm not sure, how they'll be able to catch up, because it's not just monetary. It's, schools that have been closed that we now see the data is showing hurts, poor and minority communities the most. How do you catch up from that? So I do think the effects here are going to linger significantly in ways that are only going to become clear in the next decade or so. But again, a lot of this, I think, hinges on, too, the ability of the country to reopen, right, to give people a way to earn money again. But even that, when you've been stuck at home, bereft of assistance, stuck at home caring for your kids for the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, that is going to impact us for years to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And, Jen, a lot of people who are struggling and on the margins, they can fall out of some of the statistics. We covered a story here about the number of people who had their lights and electric shut off over the past year, which showed a very different portrait than the macro numbers that we're seeing of like the jobs coming back and everybody's doing well and incomes are going up and consumer spending is surging. But because you had this incredibly unequal situation, you have people who are really, really struggling. I was thinking when Sagar was talking about another story we did on these people who were living in a sort of like weekly rental motel, many of whom had housing before the financial collapse in 2008, and then just continued to sort of like fall further and further behind, further away from that stable working class or middle class lifestyle. And I do worry for millions of people who now probably owe $10,000 in back rent, and this money isn't being efficiently distributed, that they're just going to be really out of options here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, I think it goes to a bigger debate of spending right now. With all due respect to my learned colleague, I think the way that you fix the infrastructure of distributing the funds is increasing the funds. And the way you do that is you elect more Democrats and progressives, depending on where you are in the country. The reason why this didn't work in the first place is because, once again, with all due respect, Donald Trump was in charge of jumpstarting it, and a Republican Congress was in charge of distributing it. We also had numerous Republican governors across the country fight every step of the way in terms of what we were trying to do for their citizens. I'm not saying that blue states did it perfectly. There is plenty of criticism to go around, but I am happy to see the conversation shifting from quote unquote fiscal conservatism. Even that's a term that a lot of Democrats use across the country that's being used less and less and less. Spending is popular because a government is supposed to help its citizens in crisis. And now I think we can even get past that conversation when we're out of a crisis and realize, how do we move forward as a country in almost every sector, in almost every vector? We spend more and we make sure that it's done properly. This entire pandemic has taken the mask off of the argument that, we need to be as conservative as possible in terms of the programs that we offer the citizens of America.
Well, really appreciate your guys' perspective on this. It's a really important issue, and I guarantee you a lot of people are thinking about it right now. Thank you.
Thank ladies.
Thank you.
More Rising for you after this.